What the title promises, a dramatic reversal of a long-held industry belief triggered by a specific Tesla price reveal. What the audience expects, proof that EVs are now genuinely affordable, with hard numbers and a clear before and after story. How to deliver it, lead with the price shock, then dismantle the old consensus piece by piece using real data, ending with a forward-looking challenge to the viewer. Abertura ideal, 15 seconds. The title is clear, but the price point needs one beat of context to land properly before diving into the evidence. Here is the Rotiro. For years, the auto industry had one iron rule. Electric vehicles were too expensive for regular people. Then Tesla said $24,990, and every analyst in Detroit had to sit down and rethink their spreadsheets. That number matters more than it looks. Right now, the average new electric vehicle in the United States sells for around $55,000. The average new car of any kind sells for close to $48,000. A $24,990 Tesla does not just compete with other EVs. It competes with a Honda Civic. It competes with a Toyota Corolla. It competes with the most stubborn argument the internal combustion engine ever had, which was simply that gasoline cars were cheaper to buy and everyone knew it. Today we are going to go through that argument piece by piece because the data tells a story that most people have not caught up with yet. Let us start at the beginning because the old consensus was not stupid. It was built on real numbers and real experiences, and if you dismiss it too quickly, you miss why this moment actually matters. Go back 5 or 6 years and the math on electric vehicles was genuinely discouraging for most households. The cheapest Tesla you could buy was still well above $30,000 after any incentives, and that was if you lived in a state that offered them. Other brands were even further out of reach. The Chevy Bolt was the exception, not the rule, and even the Bolt had a waiting list and a battery recall that did not exactly inspire confidence. Industry analysts at the time were writing reports with titles that might as well have said, "Do not hold your breath." Consumer surveys from that era reflected exactly what you would expect. People were interested in EVs in theory, but the list of reasons not to buy was long and specific. Range anxiety was real, not the made-up kind where someone panics about running out of charge on a 10-minute commute, but the legitimate kind where a family driving from Chicago to St. Louis in January, with the heat running and 2 kids in the back seat and a loaded cargo area, genuinely did not know if they would make it without stopping somewhere for 40 minutes. That is not irrational, that is just physics and weather combined with an infrastructure that was still being built. The charging concern was tied directly to time. Filling a gas tank takes 4 minutes. Charging an EV, even on a fast charger, used to mean 30 minutes minimum, and that was if the charger was working, which was not always guaranteed at every third-party network. JD Power was tracking charger reliability for years, and the numbers were not flattering. Some networks had failure rates that would get a gas station shut down inside a week. And then there was the sticker price. Deloitte ran a major global automotive consumer study in early 2025, and even at that point, 44% of American consumers still listed the cost premium of battery electric vehicles as one of their top concerns. That is not a fringe opinion. That is nearly half the buying public still holding on to a concern that the industry had been trying to talk them out of for a decade. The old consensus had roots. So what happened? The answer is not one thing. It is 5 or 6 things that compounded on each other over roughly 36 months. And the most important one is the one that gets the least attention in the mainstream press. Battery costs collapsed. Not gradually, not in the slow, grinding way that solar panel costs came down over 20 years. Bloomberg NEF, which tracks energy storage economics as closely as anyone on the planet, reported in late 2025 that lithium-ion battery pack prices had fallen to $108 per kilowatt hour. That was down 8% from the previous year, and it continued a trend that had been running for over a decade. But the speed at which it happened in the 2024 to 2025 window caught even optimistic analysts off guard, partly because of a specific chemistry shift. Lithium iron phosphate batteries, which the industry calls LFP, became dominant in a way that the American market did not fully anticipate. LFP chemistry is cheaper to produce because it does not use nickel or cobalt, which are expensive and geopolitically complicated to source. Chinese manufacturers had been running hard on LFP for years, and when the cost pressure hit Western automakers, the response was to follow. Tesla had already been putting LFP packs in its standard range vehicles for a while, and that decision quietly changed the economics of what a base model Tesla could cost to build without destroying the margin on every unit shipped. The manufacturing side of the equation changed just as much. Tesla's gigacasting process, which involves injecting liquid aluminum into enormous molds to produce entire sections of a vehicle's underbody in a single piece, reduced the number of individual parts in a car's rear structure from around 70 to roughly 2. 2 parts. You do not need a production line veteran to understand what that does to assembly time, labor cost, and the number of potential failure points in a vehicle's lifetime. It is one of those industrial innovations that sounds like an engineering detail until you realize it is actually a cost revolution wearing a technical disguise. Tesla announced during its second quarter 2025 earnings update that it had completed the first builds of a more affordable model in June of that year. The company said it expected volume production to begin in the second half of 2025. That is an official statement from a publicly traded company to its investors, which means it carries legal weight. It is not a tweet. It is not a podcast comment. It is the kind of statement that gets auditors and securities lawyers involved if it turns out to be false. Reuters reported in June 2025 that Elon Musk had specifically denied that a planned lower-cost electric vehicle had been canceled after an earlier Reuters report suggested some executives inside the company had raised questions about the project's future. The back and forth created confusion in the media, but the underlying fact that emerged from all of it was clear. Tesla was not walking away from an affordable vehicle. The debate was about timing and configuration, not existence. Here is what has been officially confirmed and what has not, because this distinction matters if you want to make smart decisions with real money. What is confirmed? Tesla said first builds of a more affordable model began in June 2025. Tesla said volume production was planned for the second half of 2025. Tesla told investors that expanding its lineup with more accessible vehicles was part of its strategy. Elon Musk denied the project was dead. What is not confirmed? Tesla has not issued a formal product announcement with the final retail price of $24,990. The name Model 2 is not an official Tesla designation. It is shorthand used by analysts and journalists. Specific range figures, battery size, and feature configurations for this vehicle have not been officially disclosed by Tesla in a binding product announcement. Reports about simplified interiors, smaller battery packs, and stripped-down hardware remain unverified as of the most recent available data. The $24,990 figure comes from analyst estimates, supply chain projections, and historical Tesla pricing patterns, not from a formal announcement. That does not mean it is wrong. It means it is the market's best educated guess based on what Tesla has said about its cost reduction goals and where battery economics now sit. The guess is credible. It is not confirmed. Now let us talk about why that price point would be genuinely significant. Because $24,990 is not an arbitrary number. It is a threshold. Cox Automotive reported that the average transaction price for a new electric vehicle in February 2025 was $55,273. By December of the same year, that number had moved to $58,034. Electric vehicles were actually getting more expensive on average in the market, even as the technology to make them cheaper was being deployed. That gap between what EVs cost to build and what consumers were being asked to pay for them represents the pricing power that automakers had been exercising because they could. There was no mass market affordable EV forcing anyone's hand. A $24,990 Tesla changes that calculation entirely. It sits roughly $30,000 below the current average EV transaction price. It sits below a 2025 Honda Civic Sport's base price of around $25,000 depending on trim and market conditions. It sits in the territory where monthly payments, not technology enthusiasm, drive purchase decisions. That is where the volume is. That is where the households are that have been sitting on the sideline not because they dislike electric vehicles, but because they could not make the numbers work on a family budget. Analysts have been pointing to the $25,000 threshold for years as the psychological and financial line that separates early adopter territory from mass market territory. Not because 25,000 is a magic number, but because it aligns with the financing math that a median American household can actually run without stretching uncomfortably. A 3 to 5 year loan on a $24,990 vehicle with a modest down payment produces a monthly payment that competes directly with what that same household would pay to finance a mid-range gasoline car. At that point, the conversation in a dealership showroom stops being about whether someone can afford an EV and starts being about whether they want one. That is a completely different conversation, and it is the one the EV industry has been trying to get to for a decade. Now here is the part that does not get enough attention, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. The consumer data on EV concerns has been moving faster than most people realize. realize. Plug-in America tracked a specific metric that tells you a lot about how the market is actually shifting. In 2024, 69.8% of consumers reported significant range concern before purchasing an EV. 1 year later, in 2025, that number had dropped to 48.1%. That is a 22 percentage point swing in 12 months. EY's Global Mobility Survey found that only 24% of American buyers named range limitations as a top concern in 2024, down from 30% the year before. Charging access concern dropped from 34% to 23% in the same period. People are not less informed than they were, they are more informed. They know someone who owns an EV. They have seen the charging network improve. The fear that was rational in 2019 is becoming less rational in 2026, and the data shows it happening in real time. The old consensus is not just being challenged by cheaper hardware, it is being challenged by lived experience. But here is the honest question you need to ask before you declare the internal combustion engine dead, because that would be getting ahead of the evidence. Does a cheaper Tesla solve every remaining objection to EV ownership? No. And the bear case for continued gasoline vehicle dominance is real, even if it is weaker than it used to be. Charging infrastructure outside major metro areas is still uneven. A $24,990 Tesla bought in suburban Phoenix sits in a different ownership reality than the same car bought in a rural county in Mississippi or western Kansas. The charging network that makes Tesla ownership smooth in California does not exist uniformly across the entire country, and not every household has a garage where they can install a home charger. Apartment dwellers, renters, and people in dense urban areas without dedicated parking face friction that a lower sticker price does not automatically eliminate. Resale value on EVs remains a legitimate uncertainty. Battery degradation over time, rapid technology iteration, and model updates can all affect what a used electric vehicle is worth in 5 to 7 years, and that affects the total cost calculation even if the monthly payment looks competitive on day one. And gasoline vehicles are not standing still. Hybrid technology has become dramatically better and dramatically cheaper. A Toyota hybrid system that delivers 45 to 50 miles per gallon removes most of the fuel cost argument that EVs had over standard gasoline cars without requiring any new charging infrastructure or behavioral change from the driver. The question is not just Tesla versus a gasoline car. It is Tesla versus a very good gasoline electric hybrid that refuels in 4 minutes at any of the 150,000 gas stations in America. So here is the real question for you, and this is the one worth leaving in the comments below. Do you think $24,990 is the number that finally breaks the old consensus wide open? Or do you think the charging infrastructure gap and total ownership uncertainty still give gasoline cars enough of an advantage to hold the mass market for another 5 years? Because both arguments have serious evidence behind them right now, and where you land on that question probably says something about where you live, how you drive, and what you actually need from a vehicle. Here's what the data tells us clearly. The original consensus that EVs were too expensive for mass adoption was not wrong when it formed. It was built on real price gaps, real infrastructure limitations, and real consumer surveys. But the ground underneath that consensus has shifted materially. Battery costs are at historic lows. Tesla has confirmed it is building a more affordable vehicle. Consumer concerns about range and charging are measurably declining year over year, and the price threshold that analysts have pointed to as the mass market entry point is now within the range of what Tesla has publicly signaled it intends to deliver. The biggest contradiction in this entire story is not that Tesla found a way to build a cheaper car. The biggest contradiction is the gap between how fast the economics changed and how slowly public perception followed. The data on battery costs, manufacturing efficiency, and consumer anxiety has been moving in one direction for 2 years. The popular narrative that EVs are still a luxury item has been moving on a much slower schedule. That gap is where the real story lives, and it is also where the real opportunity lives for anyone paying attention. The auto industry spent the better part of a decade arguing over whether EVs could ever reach price parity with gasoline cars. That argument was real, it was important, and for a long time it had a clear answer. The answer is no longer as clear as it used to be. A $24,990 Tesla, if it arrives at volume and holds that price in the real market, does not end the debate, but it changes the terms of the debate in a way that the gasoline-powered status quo has never had to face at this scale before. That is something worth watching very closely. Not because Tesla always delivers exactly on schedule, and not because every claim about a revolutionary affordable EV has proven out in the past, but because the underlying cost structure that would make this car possible has already been confirmed by independent sources that have no particular reason to be cheerleaders for any automaker. When battery pack prices fall to $108 per kilowatt hour and Tesla's gigacasting process drops structural parts counts from 70 components to 2, you are not dealing with hype anymore. You are dealing with engineering arithmetic. And engineering arithmetic has a way of eventually becoming the car in your driveway. If you want to stay ahead of how these shifts in the industry are actually going to affect what you drive, what you pay, and what your next car purchase looks like, join us here because we will be watching every development as it comes.